Hey guys, with the 2024 presidential election right around the corner, today I'm going to be making a prediction between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, who are both the frontrunners for their respective parties' nominations for a second time in a row. The general election is in less than a year and a half, and the first Republican debates are scheduled to be held in August in less than 3 months' time, so the GOP primary is really starting to kick off as we now have both of the major candidates in the field. Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis are now both officially candidates for the Republican nomination for the 2024 presidential election. Mike Pence is yet to announce. However, we do have Nikki Haley in the race. Tim Scott has also recently announced his candidacy, and Asa Hutchinson as well. So when looking at the Republican field, Trump is by far the frontrunner to win the nomination for a third time in a row, something that is very rarely done. You'd have to go back almost a century to see a president having won the nomination for their office more than twice. And so if we look at the Democratic side, we're seeing that Joe Biden is currently on track to winning his renomination. There really aren't going to be any debates. Joe Biden currently has around 60% support from members of his own party. He's going to basically automatically win his renomination as the incumbent president. And so I'm going to start off this map by filling in the solid states for both candidates. And the solid states are going to be states that are going to vote for either candidate by margins of over 15%. And so these are the most solid states for both nominees. Now, when looking at this map and comparing it to the 2020 map, I am not including, if we actually go to this map here, it's a little bit easier to see, I'm not including both New Jersey and Oregon as solid Democratic states. These two states simply are not going to vote for Joe Biden by as large of a margin as they did last time. Hillary Clinton did not win these states by solid margins, and so when looking at Joe Biden's current unpopularity, I see it being very difficult for him to hold on to such solid margins in his most solid states. He is still going to win them, obviously, by double-digit margins. However, there just really is not going to be the same level of enthusiasm behind a Biden re-election than when he was running to take out President Trump. And so that is why, with these solid states filled in, Joe Biden only has 159 electoral votes. As for Trump, basically the entire center of the country is going to go to him. I do think he's going to sweep the first and third districts of Nebraska, as well as the at-large vote, with a solid margin. However, I do believe that he is going to come up short in the second district. And so with all of these solid states for Trump filled in, we have 102 electoral votes for the former president. Now, before we take a look at the likely states that are going to vote for either candidate by margins of 5 to 15%, I want to look at the betting markets right now for the 2024 nomination. On the Democratic side, Joe Biden, 75% chance at winning. Honestly, that remaining 25% is mainly due to his age, as it is unlikely, but it is possible that something could happen to the president in the next year and a half. And on the Republican side, we're seeing Donald Trump right now with a 59% chance at winning. His odds are basically as high as they have ever been. You go back just 2 months, Ron DeSantis and Donald Trump were neck and neck. However, DeSantis, as we saw earlier, has been slipping in the polls from a peak of 31.3% in January 2023, now down to just 21.3%. That is a pretty significant slip over the last few months, and it's mainly a result of his unpopularity in the state of Florida, as he's been doing a lot of things that are simply not the top concerns of Florida voters. And if we look at the main market here for who's going to win the election overall, we're seeing that Joe Biden has a 45% chance at winning, Donald Trump with a 34% chance, and Ron DeSantis a 23% chance. But if you do add up the odds for both Trump and DeSantis, it comes out to 57, which means that as of right now, it does seem that bettors are more optimistic about a Republican in office after 2024. However, as the incumbent, Joe Biden is going to be pretty difficult to defeat. So coming back to the map and filling in the likely states, I'm going to start off with the likely states for Donald Trump. The first three are going to be pretty obvious: Indiana, South Carolina, and Alaska. All three of these states voted for Trump by solid double-digit margins in 2020. However, I do not believe they're going to vote for him by over 15%. Alaska and South Carolina were likely in 2020. However, Indiana was solid. If you go back to 2016, Indiana voted for Trump by 19.2%. Indiana most recently voted for a Democrat in 2008 when it voted for Barack Obama over John McCain. However, the reason I'm not giving Trump Indiana with a solid margin is because he will likely not have Mike Pence as his running mate, and Mike Pence is the pretty popular former governor of Indiana, and so without Pence on the ticket and the unpopularity of Donald Trump in Indiana as a result of his falling out with his former VP, I think the margin in Indiana is going to be just a little bit lower. I'm also going to include the 2nd District of Maine. This is a pretty conservative district. We saw it vote for Susan Collins overwhelmingly in 2020, and so in 2024, it's not really going to be any different for Donald Trump. He is going to win that 2nd District of Maine. It did vote for a Democratic governor in 2022. However, governor races are pretty different from races we see on the presidential level. On top of Maine, we also have Iowa and Ohio. Both of these states are going to be likely for Trump. I think that out of everything Trump has done for the Republican Party in terms of winning elections, I think that his two most impressive victories were in Iowa and Ohio in 2016. Now, he has not exactly been the best for helping Republicans win. However, he has had some pretty major impacts on certain races, and he was the one that was able to get Ron DeSantis in office in 2018 as governor of Florida. So if you look back at 2012, Obama won both Ohio and Iowa. 2008, it was by an even larger margin, and if you go back to 2004, 1996, you see that Iowa and Ohio were both swing states that could go either way. However, after Trump came in office in 2016, he won both states by almost double-digit margins, and essentially the same margin in 2020, despite Joe Biden winning the overall election. So Iowa and Ohio are now firmly in the Republican column, and it's unlikely that they're going to vote for a Democrat on the presidential level anytime soon. We also saw that in 2022, Tim Ryan came up short in Ohio, and of course in Iowa, Chuck Grassley was able to win re-election in the two Senate races that we had there. Now, for Joe Biden, we're going to have quite a few likely states as well. We're going to start off with Colorado and New Mexico. Both of these states voted for Biden by a double-digit margin. And then, of course, Oregon and New Jersey, the two states that I mentioned earlier, they are going to be likely, and they will vote for Joe Biden by at least 10%. The final two are going to be New Hampshire and Virginia. Virginia may have voted for Glenn Youngkin to become governor in 2021, but that really was just one election, and governor elections are very different from presidential ones. Glenn Youngkin was a much better candidate than Terry McAuliffe, and even then, he only barely won, but it was a major victory for Republicans, as it was the first Republican statewide victory in the state of Virginia in over a decade. And so this will give Joe Biden 213 electoral votes. I did actually forget Texas for Donald Trump, so Texas is going to be likely, although barely. I don't think that Texas is going to vote for Trump by over 10 points. It really has not been very kind to the former president. In 2020, Trump won Texas by a minimal 5.6% margin. In 2016, this was 9%. In 2012, Mitt Romney won the state by 15.8%. And in 2008, even John McCain did better than Trump did in 2016. So Donald Trump has had some pretty poor performances in the Lone Star State, but seeing the re-election of Greg Abbott in 2022, it is still very much conservative, and Democrats do still have a very long way to go before they're able to pick up the second largest state in the country for themselves. So with all of the likely and solid states filled in, we now have 213 electoral votes for Joe Biden and 189 for for Donald Trump. And when looking at the states you have right now on the map, these states are essentially going to vote for the candidates that I gave them to, no matter what happens. Joe Biden is at least going to win these 213 electoral votes in his very worst case scenario. And so the popularity of both candidates is now more important to look at. If we look at the popularity currently of Joe Biden, he currently has a negative 13.3% approval rating, with almost 55% of the country disapproving of the job that he has done. However, comparing his numbers to that of Trump's, during his 4 years, we see a very similar approval, and Donald Trump, until the COVID-19 pandemic, was expected to win the 2020 presidential election. I do believe that if COVID did not happen at all, Donald Trump would be the incumbent president right now. Joe Biden might have won 306 electoral votes, but it was by very narrow margins in many states. Pennsylvania, just a 1.2% margin. Wisconsin, 0.63%. Georgia, it was a 0.23% margin, and Arizona, a margin of just 0.3%. Joe Biden barely won in 2020, and a big reason for that was the COVID-19 pandemic. So when we look at Trump's numbers, they really are not as bad as they seemed. If you look at this in hindsight, you might say that Trump was always going to lose because of just how unpopular he was, but really, if you look at this 3-year mark here, just a year before the election, Donald Trump was heavily favored to win against whoever the Democratic nominee was going to be. At that time, it honestly looked like it might have been Bernie Sanders for a while before Joe Biden came in and eventually won the nomination. If we look at the approval rating of Donald Trump, this is going to be his favorability. It has gone up quite a bit over the last few weeks, now to 9.4%. It did reach a low of negative 15 just a few weeks ago in early April, but it has since recovered slightly. So Donald Trump, not very popular either. Both candidates are going to have quite a hard time gaining enthusiasm without playing off of the other candidates' unpopularity. So when looking at the remaining states, I'm going to fill in the lean states first. These are margins of between 1 and 5%. So Minnesota, Michigan, they're going to go to Joe Biden. It is unlikely that he loses both of these states. Minnesota did vote for Biden by a 7-point margin in 2020, but it really is going to be very difficult for him to win by that margin once again. Minnesota is continuing to shift to the right, although it does have the distinction of being the state with the longest unbroken streak of voting for every single Democratic nominee, going all the way back to the election of Jimmy Carter, I believe, or actually a little bit earlier than that. You'd have to go back to Walter Mondale. Ever since he won it, Democrats have never lost Minnesota in a presidential election. And so the final lean Democratic state is going to be Nevada. I think this one is going to be the toughest. The state is shifting to the right. They just elected a new Republican governor to replace Steve Sisolak, and Catherine Cortez Masto on the Democratic level, or on the Senate level, as the incumbent Democratic senator, barely won re-election to another 6-year term in last November. So Nevada is going to be a very big battleground this time around, I believe larger than it was in 2020. However, at this point in time, it is more likely than not that Joe Biden is going to carry the state. We also have 2 lean states for Trump, these being North Carolina and Florida. North Carolina and Florida, I do think, are both going to vote for Donald Trump by larger margins than they did in 2020. If you look at these margins, they are going to be 1.3% in North Carolina and 3.4% in Florida. I think that the Florida margin might reach 5 points, but right now around 4% would be my best guess, and in North Carolina, 2 to 3% is very likely. Joe Biden did do well in the state in 2020, but it is going to be very difficult for him to actually end up winning the state, especially when he's running for re-election. And so we now have 4 states left. These realistically could go both ways. They're going to be the closest of the close states, and currently I have 2 going to Joe Biden and 2 going to Donald Trump. The first one I'm going to give to Donald Trump is Georgia, 16 electoral votes. The state voted for Joe Biden by a 0.23% margin in 2020, making it the closest state of the year, and Democrats have since been able to win both Senate seats in the state. However, seeing just the huge margin that Brian Kemp won re-election by in 2022, it's clear that Georgia is still a Republican state at heart, although Democrats are gaining ground pretty quickly. I think in a decade, it'll be very difficult for Republicans to win, but as of this point in time, Georgia is still more Republican than it is Democratic, and considering the very narrow margin Joe Biden had last time, I am going to give the state to the former president. As for Joe Biden, I'm giving him the state of Arizona and its 11 electoral votes. In Arizona, Democrats have also been seeing a very positive trend, just like they have been in Georgia. 2020, of course, a 0.3% margin for Biden against Trump. However, I do think he's going to be able to hold on to the state this time around. We've seen some pretty convincing victories for Democrats here over the last few years, especially in 2022, when Katie Hobbs defeated Kari Lake in the gubernatorial race. That was a huge high-stakes election, and Kari Lake was looking like she was almost guaranteed to win. She was up by 5 points in the polls at one point, but Katie Hobbs did come and take the governorship away from her, and so I think that in the next decade, Democrats are going to have a pretty strong trend in Arizona as the state continues to shift to the left. The final state I'm giving Trump is Wisconsin. 10 electoral votes. Trump won the state by 0.75% in 2016. It was a big victory, the first time Wisconsin went red in almost 3 decades. And in 2024, I think that out of all 4 of the upper Rust Belt states, Wisconsin is going to be one that Trump can win the most. In Pennsylvania, 19 electoral votes. This is Joe Biden's birth state. I think it'll definitely be closer than it was in 2020, but it will still be in the Biden column. And so as of right now, this is my prediction. I did actually forget 2 areas of the country, so I apologize about that. The at-large vote in Maine is going to be likely Democratic, and the 2nd district of Nebraska is going to be lean for Joe Biden. I think he'll do worse than he did in 2020, as the district's borders have changed very slightly from the last election. However, it is still going to be a pretty big victory for Joe Biden. That one electoral vote makes more of a difference than you think, as it is possible for there to be an electoral map tie. It was more possible in 2020, but in 2024, it is not far from being impossible. So 277, 261. This is my latest and most updated prediction for the 2024 presidential election between the 2 frontrunners, Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure you like it down below if you enjoyed it. There's a link to my Discord server at the top of the description as well, so make sure you join that if you haven't. Like this video if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I will see you guys next week for another video.